Okay, everybody, we're back for part 2 of the lecture on the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And so we have just been talking about the spinal cord and its structure and how it's arranged. And then we also looked at how the afferent system can stimulate and bring information toward the CNS and how we get a response. But so let's look a little bit more closely at the peripheral nervous system and the efferent division of that peripheral nervous system. So again, this is the communication link by which the central nervous system controls activities of muscles and glands. So there's really two divisions of the efferent division in the peripheral nervous system. So you can see I have the efferent division circled and then the other two divisions below that. So the somatic nervous system is what is subject to voluntary control. So this is the control coming from the cortex of our brain from the central nervous system. And motor neurons then will originate there and stretch all the way toward our skeletal muscles to innervate the skeletal muscle. On the blue portion there, that's the autonomic nervous system. And this is an involuntary branch of the peripheral nervous system in order to control our internal organs. And the muscle associated with them, like cardiac muscle with our heart, smooth muscle associated with most of our other organs and blood vessels, most of our exocrine glands and some of our endocrine glands, and also even our adipose tissue. So one of the key differences is not only the separate nerve pathways, but the arrangement and sequence of the nerves. The autonomic is more complex. So let's start with the somatic efferent system. Okay, so to contract a muscle cell, this is what we're talking about. We need to activate a motor neuron, right? And so again, we already looked at this when we looked at the brain. We saw the in the frontal lobe, the motor gyrus, which lies just in front of the central sulcus. And there you can see an example of two motor neurons that are going to innervate different skeletal muscles. And so what I want you to notice here is that the motor neuron originates in the central nervous system, and that first neuron stays within the central nervous system. So that would be referred to as an interneuron. So there's actually only one peripheral motor neuron that goes to the skeletal muscle cell. So the cell body originates within the central nervous system, and you can see they're either the brain or lower down in the spinal cord. But then most of that peripheral nerve then extends through the peripheral nervous system, right? Coming out one of the spinal nerves, leading to skeletal muscle, depending on what the skeletal muscle is. So again, this is a voluntary control. So this is different than what we were just talking about with our reflex arc. This is voluntary control. And we know that just looking at the picture, because again, the nerve pathway is originating in the motor cortex, right? The cortex of the cerebrum. So that's where we get higher processing and voluntary control. This is where you're making a decision. I want to move my arm or my leg or something. Okay, so this pathway is always excitatory because later on we're going to learn about the synapses and the neurotransmitters that's used. So that means it's always excitatory in this simple pathway. All right. In the autonomic nervous system, let me focus in on this for you. Right? Again, this is where we're controlling our organs. So this is innervating our organs, or the nerve connection to our organs. Okay? There's a difference here in the receptor and the effector location. Okay? In the autonomic nervous system, the afferent pathways always originate in the visceral receptors. So we're usually making a response. This is part of the homeostasis that we talked about. We're going to have an efferent control based on the sensory information we're also receiving from our organs, okay? So there is an afferent pathway that originates in the visceral receptors, which are going to bring information to the brain, again, usually in the hypothalamus, information about our homeostatic variables. How much water is there? How much oxygen? Is there too much waste? Whatever it may be. Okay, so now what we want to do is talk about that efferent response. So just the efferent size. Okay, so again, the information will come from the hypothalamus, and you can see there's an interneuron there, that purple color there, coming from the hypothalamus down the spinal cord. But then it will synapse with one of a series of 2 peripheral motor neurons. So the cell body of the first motor neuron will originate in the spinal cord, but the rest of the neuron will extend through the peripheral system, right? It will form the first part of a nerve, okay? And so that's the first one, is the red nerve indicated there in the picture. That is the preganglionic neuron, okay? So that gets stimulated by the CNS, the preganglionic neuron. It's a motor nerve, and then it will synapse within a ganglion. And a ganglion is a structure outside of the central nervous system. It's part of the peripheral nervous system that contains the cell body of a postganglionic neuron. Okay, and so that's where the synapse occurs between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. It's that postganglionic neuron then, once it's stimulated by the preganglionic neuron, sends that action potential down its axon all the way to the organ that it's going to innervate. And so maybe if it's the cardiac muscle, it's going to increase our heart activity, something like that. Maybe it's going to decrease our heart activity. Okay, and so therefore the response can either be excitatory or inhibitory. It can be either one. Okay, so the thing right now to remember, and we're going to go in more detail in this, but we're in the autonomic nervous division, and we're going to send a response, a motor response, an efferent response to our effector organs, okay, our organs that are contained either in our thoracic cavity or in our abdominal cavity, and we're going to control them through innervating the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, or lipids, adipocytes, and I see that's covered for some reason there. Okay, and that's going to happen through an efferent nerve, right? And that efferent nerve in the PNS is going to always have a series of 2 neurons. There's a preganglionic neuron that gets stimulated by the neuron within the CNS. That preganglionic neuron then synapses within a ganglion with a postganglionic neuron. So you can see why it's named that way. Preganglionic neuron, the most of the nerve occurs before the ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron originates, the cell body is within the ganglion, but the rest of the nerve is outside of the ganglion. Okay? All right, so keep those in mind because we're going to look at this a little more closely. Okay, and so we can compare the two. We just talked about the somatic nervous system, or stimulating a voluntary stimulation of skeletal muscle, and the autonomic nervous system, stimulating an organ, and that's involuntary. That's we don't have higher brain processes. So you can see from both pictures, in the somatic, the interneuron starts in the cortex of the motor gyrus. Okay. In the ANS, it starts usually in the hypothalamus, and that's what it's indicating there. Okay. In the somatic nervous system, again, it's going to synapse with a motor neuron, and there's only one motor neuron that goes to the skeletal muscle, a peripheral nerve that goes to the skeletal muscle. In the ANS, it's 2 neurons in series. You got your preganglionic neuron and your postganglionic neuron. And the postganglionic neuron then is what ultimately stimulates the effector organ. Okay, let's keep going with the ANS because it gets more complex like that than that. So this slide actually shows you that two neuron series. Okay, again, we're starting from the CNS, but these nerves span through the PNS, so they are considered peripheral nerves. And so you have your two efferent neuron chain, the preganglionic fiber and the postganglionic fiber. Okay, the ganglia, or one ganglion, are where the synapses of the pre and the postganglionic fibers occur in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, and so we're also going to look at those because those are going to be anatomically different depending on what the effect is being produced on the organ, or the effect we want produced on the organ. And that has to do with the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So these are two different functional nervous systems within two different anatomical pathways of nerves. So the sympathetic system that you see on the left, this is the nerve system that gets stimulated during an emergency or a stressful situation. It's referred to as fight or flight. Okay, if you're in an emergency or a stressful situation, you either want to fight your way out or you want to run away, fight or flight. It also prepares the body for strenuous physical activity because that's what happens in fight or flight. But this could also pertain to exercise. Okay, the parasympathetic system that you see over on the right side dominates when you're in a quiet, relaxed situation. So we call that rest and digest. Okay, when you're nice and calm, that's a good time to digest. These are body maintenance activities like digestion. It could be going to the bathroom, something like that, right? So most of our visceral organs are innervated by both, and they produce antagonistic effects on a particular organ. One ramps the organ up, the activity, the other one slows it down. Okay, but again, it also depends on what state you're in. So parasympathetic doesn't always mean it slows down an organ, because when you're in a rest situation and you want to increase the activity of your digestive system, so parasympathetic nerves do that. So that stimulates the digestive system. But it might slow down the heart. You can slow down your heart rate while you're digesting. Okay, so it's actually slowing down, inhibiting the activity of the heart. Right? The other thing then, again, I mentioned it's anatomically different. So the sympathetic division actually originates in a part of the spinal cord, and those nerves originate in the thoracic area and the lumbar area. So sometimes we refer to the sympathetic division as the thoracolumbar division. Okay? And then in the peripheral system, you notice on the right, that originates from certain cranial nerves. Okay, not all of them, but some cranial nerves. And then the sacral nerves, so the sacral division as well. So that's also the parasympathetic division, might be called the craniosacral division. Okay, and then remember we have ganglia associated with each. And so in the sympathetic division, you can see the ganglia lie really close to the spinal cord, and they're referred to as the sympathetic chain ganglia because they're connected to one another like a chain. And you can see that they're right next to our spinal cord, just to the right of it. Okay, they're also referred to as paravertebral ganglia because they're located just outside of the vertebrae. I'll show you another picture of that in a minute. The ganglia of the parasympathetic division is located closer to the organ, or it may be within the organ. Okay, so it's actually much further away from the spinal cord. Alrighty. Oh, in the sympathetic division, there's also collateral ganglia that'll be right in front of the spinal cord in the abdominal cavity. Or we're going to deal with the adrenal gland. So we're going to go over each one of those things. Okay. So just to kind of review, the sympathetic division is your fight or flight division. So this is the division that dominates during stressful situation. It prepares your body for physical activity. right? So in sympathetic, we're going to stimulate the heart rate. We're going to stimulate the blood pressure, increase it. We're going to inhibit the digestive system, okay? In the parasympathetic system, it dominates during quiet and relaxed situations. So these nerves are active when you're relaxed. But again, so it might slow down the heart rate, lower your blood pressure, but it's going to increase the activity to your digestive organs, right? It's a good time to do that. And there's other, of course, all your other organs are associated, but these are the easiest examples to give. And understand that most of our organs are actually innervated by both, okay? And they produce antagonistic effects of a particular organ. So the sympathetic can increase your heart rate and the parasympathetic can decrease your heart rate, okay? Again, just depends on the conditions of the body, what is needed at that moment. All right, let's look at the sympathetic division. And here, I mentioned this already, but this is a little closer view. So we want to look at the ganglia associated in the sympathetic division. Here you can see the spinal cord all the way to the left and the spinal nerves that branch off of it. There's the dorsal root ganglion. And then you have a series of ganglia stacked on top of one another in a vertical chain, okay? And so they're connected to one another. We're actually going to look at the pathway of that red efferent nerve with an E, efferent, or motor nerve, and learn the pathway that these nerves take to innervate different organs. And it's going to be different if we're innervating organs in the thoracic cavity or in the abdominal cavity. You can also see way over to the right, kind of underneath the intestines, and that's just where the pictures lie. But that shows the collateral ganglion that's also attached. That collateral ganglion, this structure is stretched out to the right. That collateral ganglion would actually fold inward and rest on the ventral side of the spinal cord within your abdominal cavity. So I'll show you that picture in just a minute. But first, let me show you another picture of the chain ganglia. So now you can see the vertebrae, and you see the chain ganglia. I circled them there. They lie just outside of the vertebrae. So they're actually different than the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion are hidden by the bones of the vertebrae. The chain ganglia are on the outside of the vertebrae and lie right next to it. So sometimes instead of calling them the sympathetic chain ganglia, they're called the paravertebral ganglia. The other thing to remember, dorsal root ganglia are associated with the sensory aspect of our nervous system. Those are where our afferent nerves come in, and we have the cell bodies of our afferent nerves. So there's a lot of anatomy you need to understand in order to understand the physiology of this. So it's very important that you review your anatomy of your spinal cord. Okay, so let's look at how we would stimulate a sympathetic response to organs located within our thoracic cavity. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at the sequence of our preganglionic and postganglionic fibers and what structures those axons pass through in order to innervate the organs in the thoracic cavity. Okay, so you are going to be learning a pathway. And some of you might have done this in anatomy already, but I know not every instructor may cover this. So I want to make sure that we cover it here because it's really about the functioning, how we stimulate our organs in our body cavities. Okay, so the picture below there is actually from the anatomy book. And I put these slides on the PowerPoint slides on Canvas. So if you need to blow that up so it's a little bit bigger, you can go ahead and do so. But what we're going to do is we're going to start an efferent response to an organ in the thoracic cavity. And our preganglionic fiber, the cell body, always starts in the lateral horn. So if you go back and you look at the function of our lateral horn, we said that's where the nerves begin in order to innervate our visceral organs. So all of our pathways will start in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord. You can say lateral horn or you can say lateral gray horn. It doesn't matter. Okay. So you can see there the lateral horn starts, or the cell body starts in the lateral horn, and then the axon then stretches through the ventral root, okay, and then it merges with a spinal nerve, okay, and then there is a branching of the spinal nerve downward, and this one goes downward, and that's the white ramus, and that is a connection from the spinal nerve to the sympathetic chain ganglion, okay, one of them. Okay, so our axon left the lateral gray horn through the ventral root into the spinal nerve, down the white ramus, into the sympathetic chain ganglion. That was our preganglionic fiber. Then we have a synapse with our postganglionic fiber. Now our postganglionic fiber has to merge back with the spinal nerve. So the axon of the postganglionic fiber travels up through the gray ramus, which connects to our spinal nerve. And now that spinal nerve then stretches and innervates organs in the thoracic cavity. And that organ could be the heart, to stimulate the heart. So you should then know what the function is. Pick an organ like the heart and say it increases heart rate. So what I have written there is what you need to know. So if I ask you, what is a pathway to a sympathetic pathway to stimulate an organ in the thoracic cavity, or your goal is to increase the heart rate through a sympathetic response, right? So you would just tell me your preganglionic fiber starts in the lateral horn, or you can write just what I wrote there, exits the lateral horn of the spinal cord, enters the ventral root, okay, merges with the spinal nerve, goes down the white ramus, enters the sympathetic chain ganglion. From there, it synapses with the postganglionic neuron, okay, travels up the gray ramus, merges with the spinal nerve, and that spinal nerve now then innervates an effector organ, for example, the heart rate, to increase the heart rate. Okay. That, in general, takes care of our thoracic cavity. Okay, let me show you this first before I go on, actually. So when we have a sympathetic response, you're not just going to innervate your heart. You might increase your breathing rate at the same time. You're going to dilate blood vessels at the same time, right? You might constrict others all at the same time. And this is where that concept of divergence comes in, right? So in divergence, that single preganglionic neuron could branch and synapse with a number of postganglionic neurons in different sympathetic chain ganglia. So I put those red arrows there to show you that that single preganglionic neuron is actually branching and synapsing. This picture is showing us 3 different postganglionic fibers. So that's how we can get this mass response. Okay, we don't sit there and wait. First the heart increases, and then your breathing rate increases, and then your blood vessels dilate. That wouldn't make sense. This through the idea of divergence, we can stimulate those organs all at the same time. Okay, so that's the thoracic cavity. What about the abdominal cavity, right? So some preganglionic fibers, oh, I just noticed that's a typo there. It should say some preganglionic fibers don't synapse in the chain ganglia. They actually synapse in the collateral ganglia. I will fix that typo on the PowerPoint uploaded to Canvas, but I'm not going to fix it on the video because I would have to redo this whole video, and I'm not going to do that. So that should say some preganglionic fibers do not synapse in the chain ganglia. They actually synapse in the collateral ganglia. It's somewhat correct, but it doesn't make as much sense. So what we're going to see now is a fiber is going to travel through the sympathetic chain ganglia. It's not going to synapse there. It's going to continue and its axon is going to stretch all the way to the collateral ganglia and synapse with the postganglionic fiber there. And here's a picture in the abdominal cavity of the collateral ganglia. They sit right in front of the aorta, which sits right in front of your spinal cord, your vertebrae. Okay, and so you can see there's a series of collateral ganglia there. They have specific names like the celiac ganglia and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. You don't have to remember those names, but you should remember that they're called collateral ganglion. Okay, so here we go, another pathway. Now the goal is to stimulate an organ in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. And so our pathway is similar, it just gets longer. So the preganglionic fiber exits the lateral horn of the spinal cord to the ventral root and enters a spinal nerve. And then it goes down the white ramus into the sympathetic ganglia, but it doesn't synapse in the chain ganglia. It actually leaves out of the ganglia into what's called a splanchnic nerve. This is an extension from the ganglion toward the collateral ganglion in front of your aorta. That's called a splanchnic nerve. So from the splanchnic nerve, then the preganglionic fiber synapses within the collateral ganglion with a postganglionic fiber. Now we're on ganglion. Now we're on the neuron number 2, the postganglionic neuron. So from that synapse, then the postganglionic axons leave the collateral ganglion and they innervate an organ. They synapse with an organ in your abdominal pelvic cavity. Baby, what it's doing is slowing your kidney down. It's slowing down the production of urine. Okay, when you're in a sympathetic fight or flight situation, you don't want to form a lot of urine. That takes a lot of blood supply, and you can temporarily slow that process down. Okay, it might relax the smooth muscle in the wall of the urinary bladder, right? It could stimulate the lipids in your adipose tissue to release more glucose so that your cells can make more energy. So it can do a lot of different things. Okay, so make sure you know that pathway to stimulate a sympathetic response in the abdominal cavity. And it's more proper to say the abdominal pelvic cavity because it could be down in the pelvic cavity as well. That's what I have written in red there. Okay, that's a sympathetic response, including the collateral ganglia now. Okay, so while all of this is happening, so nerves are firing, but one thing to remember about nerves is we can't keep up the response of a nerve for a long period of time. And that's because of the movement of sodium and potassium to get the action potentials that our sodium potassium pumps can't always keep up. So we cannot keep up a nerve stimulation in the long term. So what do? Hormones come in. And so what we're going to do is release hormones out of the adrenal gland. And here in this picture, you can see our adrenal glands are circled there. They sit on top of our kidneys. Okay, they're not connected to our kidneys. They're a separate organ, but that's just where they're located. And we can get sympathetic nerves to stimulate the adrenal glands to release hormones, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine. And epinephrine is also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine is also known as noradrenaline. So you might be familiar with those terms. And most what will be stimulated to be released is epinephrine, but it does stimulate about 20% of it is norepinephrine. And what these hormones do is they're able to maintain the effects that the other nerves started. Epinephrine can keep your heart rate up. It can keep your breathing rate up. Okay, it can just can maintain what's already been started. So if you're in a fight or flight situation for a longer period of time, we've got to get the hormones involved. Okay, they're slower to respond, but they can keep the response going longer. So that's why we have a combination of nerve stimulation and hormone stimulation. Okay, Here's a little bit more on that adrenal gland. Okay. So you can see that it has different tissue types in the cortex and in the middle. So we're talking about the adrenal medulla. That's in the middle, and that's composed of modified postganglionic neurons. So it's nerve tissue in the middle. Later in the semester, we're going to talk about the cortex of the adrenal gland. Okay, but here right now, just remember, it's the modified postganglionic neurons, and they create epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so we need to stimulate this. We're going to use a nerve to stimulate the adrenal gland. And we've got a pathway for that. And again, it's the same pathway that we've been following, but we're just going to add to it. So we start with our preganglionic neuron. It exits the lateral horn of the spinal cord. It enters the ventral root. It goes down the white ramus and enters the sympathetic ganglia. No synapse there. It leaves the ganglia as a splanchnic nerve and enters the collateral ganglia, no synapse there. And then it stretches from the collateral ganglia to the adrenal medulla. And remember, the postganglionic fibers now are located within the adrenal medulla, and they will be stimulated now to secrete epinephrine or norepinephrine into the blood. And it maintains all the effects that we've been talking about in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. All right. So in the parasympathetic nervous system, this is much more simple. You don't have all these pathways to remember because most parasympathetic fibers don't travel within spinal nerves. Okay. And so it's much more simple. And like I mentioned, many of them have ganglia that are located near the organ to be innervated or within the organ to be innervated. So the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic originate from the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord, and they tend to be long because they're going all the way to the effector organ. Okay, therefore, the postganglionic fibers are pretty short. Okay. So we have, you've already learned about some of the parasympathetic nerves if you've been in anatomy. And so again, the cranial nerves that are associated with the parasympathetic division are just these cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 3, which is your oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 7, which is your facial nerve. And cranial nerve 9, which is your glossopharyngeal nerve. And I know I didn't have to tell you any of that. You remember that from anatomy, don't you? And so then your preganglionic fibers from the sacral area 2 through 4, they innervate the lower half of your large intestine, the rectum, the urinary tract, and the reproductive systems as well. Okay, so there's no pathways to learn here. Just really know what the functions are. And you have a nice table in your book, and you can use that to kind of compare and contrast the sympathetic and parasympathetic effects in your autonomic nervous system. Okay, and so remember that there are always some exceptions to the rule of dual innervation. So dual innervation, remember I mentioned earlier that most of our organs have both sympathetic nerve and parasympathetic nerves that control them in an antagonistic way. But here, most of our arterioles and veins actually only receive sympathetic nerve fibers. So they can just be inhibited when you want to dilate them. Most sweat glands are innervated only by the sympathetic nerves. Your salivary glands can be innervated by both ANS divisions, but activity is not antagonistic. They both actually cause salivary secretion. So for example, when you're in a parasympathetic state, that's where it's a good time to digest, and we need saliva. So your parasympathetic nerves might stimulate a more watery saliva, which is more conducive to digestion. Whereas the sympathetic will release a more pasty saliva. Your mouth actually feels dry, but there's actually a saliva in there. That's why when you get nervous for an interview or something, your mouth gets all dry and you feel like you can't formulate words correctly, bring a bottle of water with you. It's appropriate to do that. And then it can help you out in an interview. Trust me. All right. And we're almost done here, so I'll keep going. But let's look at the neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system. This is why you had to learn all of that in the first unit. If you didn't pick it up in the first unit, now you have to pick up the different types of neurotransmitters in this unit. So your preganglionic neurons, they always release acetylcholine. Okay, so just memorize that. Preganglionic neurons, when they synapse with the postganglionic neurons, it's always acetylcholine that's released there. But then at the postganglionic neurons, you can get a different neurotransmitter depending on if whether in the parasympathetic or the sympathetic division. So parasympathetic postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine also. So the whole pathway in parasympathetic is acetylcholine. But if we're in the sympathetic division, then they release norepinephrine, NE. Okay, norepinephrine. And just a note, we saw in the somatic nervous system, the voluntary system, when we stimulate voluntary movements of our skeletal muscle, that's also acetylcholine. Okay, so let me show you a nice picture here that some of you are more visual, so maybe this will help you. So you can see what we've got here is the different responses or different stimulation in the different systems. So at the top there, we've got all the preganglionic neurons that you see. They are called cholinergic neurons because they release ACH, acetylcholine. That's a cholinergic neurotransmitter. So cholinergic neurons make cholinergic neurotransmitters, which is always ACH. Okay, so ACH gets released from preganglionic neurons. Then the postganglionic neurons, you can see is different in the different systems. So we said from the sympathetic nervous system at the top, that postganglionic neuron is releasing norepinephrine. That's an adrenergic neuron. Okay, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So that means that the effector organ has a receptor on it that is an adrenergic receptor. It responds to norepinephrine. Okay, in the middle one there, that's stimulating the adrenal gland. So again, that's from the sympathetic division as well. And so the postganglionic fibers there are nicotinic receptor or nicotinic neurons. So they release epinephrine. I'm sorry, the preganglionic fibers are nicotinic cholinergic receptors. That's ACH. The postganglionic fibers that are embedded within the medulla releases epinephrine. And we're going to look at these types of receptors in just a few slides. And we're going to layer on some of these new terms that you're learning here. Okay? And then at the bottom, again, that's showing norepinephrine again and an adrenergic neuron as well. Okay, those are all sympathetic. This is parasympathetic. This is ACH being released at the preganglionic fiber and also ACH being released at the postganglionic fiber. But at the postganglionic fiber, that can be either excitatory or inhibitory. And so that happens because that has a different type of receptor. This is called a muscarinic receptor. We learned this in the previous unit. Muscarinic receptors can either be associated with a sodium ion channel, so you get excitatory, or it could be associated with a potassium ion channel, really through a G protein complex. And so that would be inhibitory. Okay, so that's how you can get different responses from the same neurotransmitter. It's because the receptor is a little different. Okay, so again, the release of ACH at motor neurons and preganglionic fibers is always excitatory. Okay, so that means those receptors are cholinergic receptors and they're nicotinic receptors. That's always excitatory. Nicotinic receptors are always excitatory because they always open sodium cation channels, and that causes depolarization, right? At the postganglionic fibers, they're usually excitatory, but they're sometimes inhibitory, like the vagus nerve that slows your heart rate. That releases ACH. So that means that those are muscarinic receptors, and that's a G protein coupled receptor. And so that depends on the target cell. That can either be inhibitory or excitatory, right? But those bind to ACH. So cholinergic receptors can be nicotinic or they can be muscarinic. They both bind to ACH, but they have different effects. Okay. If it's a norepinephrine that we're talking about, then the receptor that receives norepinephrine or epinephrine is an adrenergic receptor. Remember, the norepinephrine and epinephrine are catecholamines, and so their receptors are adrenergic. They're all G protein coupled receptors, all of them. Okay. And the dissociation can either cause an ion channel to open or an enzyme to be activated. Okay. So you get different responses that occur there. Okay. And so we have alpha receptors and beta receptors. You might know people who have heart problems, they take beta blockers. So it's a drug that's blocking the beta receptors to help slow the heart rate down. Beta blockers. Okay, so this slide is also explained here. Again, if you're more visual, this might help you out. This is regarding the cholinergic neurotransmitter ACH and the cholinergic receptors. So there are two types of cholinergic receptors that respond to ACH. The first one is nicotinic. Okay, the nicotinic receptors are always excitatory because it's always opening a sodium channel, allowing sodium in. You can see potassium's moving out, but remember, it's always more sodium in, so that's a depolarization. That's why it's always excitatory. The other type is a muscarinic receptor, also responds to ACH. But those are G protein coupled receptors, and it just depends on the cell that's being innervated. The G protein receptor, you can see one of them, one type, can open a potassium channel. Potassium moves out, that's hyperpolarization. So you've inhibited the heart rate. You slow the heart rate down. Your vagus nerve slows your heart rate down. That's how it does it. Okay. And the other one, maybe it's excitatory. Okay, maybe it's, remember during parasympathetic, you want to increase the activity of your digestive organs. So that causes the digestive muscle or the muscles of the digestive tract to contract. So that's excitatory. So here you can see in this G protein coupled pathway, it's actually, it can close sodium channels or it can open a calcium channel. And so either way, it's causing, it could close a potassium channel, So that means potassium stays in, positive ions stay in, or it can open a sodium or calcium channel. And that means positive ions move in. Remember that sodium and calcium are both more highly concentrated outside of the cell. And so when you open a channel, they want to move in. That is something many of you missed on the last test, and I think I repeated that again and again and again. This is why you have to remember that. Okay, so those things cause depolarization and causes excitation of that organ. That's the response. So here's a little more on adrenergic stimulation. Again, the different responses happen because there are two major subtypes of these receptors. You've got alpha and beta. And even those are broken down into its own subtypes. You got alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. You don't have to know all of those, but you should be aware that there are two different major subtypes called alpha and beta. And there you can see in the table the different responses you can get. I don't care that you know what the specific responses that come out of alpha and beta subtype receptors, but I want you to know that that's why you can have either excitation or inhibition. These adrenergic receptors, again, are referring specifically to receptors that respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. The previous ones, muscarinic and nicotinic, these are cholinergic receptors, and they respond specifically to ACH. Okay, and they also can give either excitatory or inhibitory responses. So you have to understand why that is. Here's just again, just to illustrate it, if that helps you, to show just the different structural differences between alpha and beta receptors. Okay, so they're just structurally different from one another. Okay. And again, there are some useful drugs that have been developed to affect the autonomic nervous receptors. So drugs that promote the actions of a neurotransmitter are called agonists. So when you want more of the same, then that's an agonist. So, for example, and again, you don't have to memorize this, but just to illustrate the point, terbutaline is a beta 2 agonist, and it relaxes the bronchioles to help people with asthma. It keeps the airways open so you can breathe better. Those drugs that inhibit the actions of a neurotransmitter are called antagonists. Okay, antagonist means they do the opposite. Right? So for example, atenolol is a beta 1 antagonist. It slows the cardiac rate down and lowers blood pressure is the effect. So it has it's an antagonist to the epinephrine. Okay. And then finally, I just threw this on here. It's probably more appropriate just to look at it from the PowerPoint. And it's just a comparison of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, and the differences between the pre and the post-ganglionic fibers and what neurotransmitters are used. So that might help organize your thoughts. All right, everybody, that's it for the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good day.